Story number 1. The shadows that breathe. The wind here doesn't howl. It screams. That's the first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the helicopter onto the frozen expanse of nothingness. The air carried a sound like a dying animal, a guttural wail that set my teeth on edge. In front of me stood the research station, a forgotten relic from the 1960s, shrouded in decades of snow and silence. I pulled my scarf tighter, feeling the sting of frostbite at my exposed cheeks. "You sure about this, man?" asked Chris, my cameraman. His breath formed a ghostly cloud in the frigid air. "Places like this? They're bad news." "Relax," I replied, though my voice betrayed a sliver of doubt. "It's just a story. A story. That's what I told myself this was. Just another creepy tale for my growing YouTube channel. My subscribers love tales of the macabre. And this station, once a bustling hub of scientific discovery before its abrupt abandonment, was ripe with the kind of mystery that would rack up views. But the stories, God, the stories, they stuck in my mind like jagged thorns. Faceless shadows in the windows, footsteps that echoed in empty hallways, and the disappearances, the chilling rumors of researchers vanishing without a trace. I'd brushed them off as exaggerated campfire tales. Until now, the station loomed ahead, its dark windows like unblinking eyes watching our every move. We hauled our gear inside, grateful to escape the bone-snapping cold. The air inside was stagnant, heavy with a scent I couldn't place, like mildew mixed with something metallic. "Looks like no one's been here in decades," Sarah, my producer, murmured. Her voice seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. "Let's keep it that way," Chris muttered, shivering. We spent the first few hours setting up. The station's interior was a labyrinth of narrow hallways and empty rooms, each more suffocating than the last. Faded photographs of smiling scientists lined the walls, their eyes glinting with a hope that now felt tragically misplaced. I tried to ignore the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, or the faint creaks that echoed from somewhere deep within the station. Night fell quickly here, swallowing the landscape in a thick, impenetrable darkness. We huddled in the common room, the hum of our portable heaters doing little to chase away the chill. "I found this in one of the labs," Sarah said, holding up a dusty notebook. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the words were legible enough. "It's a journal," she read aloud. The entries began innocuously, details of experiments, notes on the weather, but they grew more erratic as time went on. Mentions of strange noises and shapes moving in the corner of my eye. Then the final entry. "I saw it last night, staring at me through the window. It doesn't have a face. God help us, it doesn't have a face." Chris scoffed, but I saw the way his hands shook as he adjusted the camera. "Probably just cabin fever," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. That night, I awoke to the sound of footsteps. They weren't loud, just a soft, deliberate padding that echoed down the hallway outside my door. I held my breath, straining to hear. They stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. I convinced myself it was my imagination. The next day, things escalated. We explored the lower levels, where the air was colder and the shadows deeper. It was there we found the first sign of something wrong. A lab, frozen in time, beakers still filled with murky liquid, a whiteboard covered in equations, and on the far wall, deep scratches carved into the metal, as though something or someone had been trying to claw their way out. That night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, heart hammering against my ribs. The hallway was empty. Then I saw it, a shadow, darker than the others, standing at the far end of the corridor. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel it watching me. "Who's there?" I whispered. The shadow twitched. Slowly, it began to move toward me, the sound of its footsteps sharp and deliberate. I stumbled back into my room and slammed the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. For the rest of the night, I sat with my back against the door, clutching a crowbar. By the third day, the station felt alive. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows writhed, and the air was thick with an unnatural tension. Chris swore he saw a face in the window, a face without features. Sarah started mumbling to herself, her eyes darting nervously to the corners of the room. And then there was the scream. It echoed through the station, a blood-curdling shriek that froze the marrow in my bones. We ran toward the sound, only to find an empty corridor. But on the floor was a single, wet footprint, too large to belong to any of us. That night, Sarah vanished. We searched every inch of the station, but she was gone. The only sign of her was her camera, lying abandoned in the hallway. The footage was corrupted, except for a single frame, a blurry image of a faceless figure standing behind her. By the fourth day, Chris and I were unraveling. He wanted to leave, but the helicopter wouldn't return for another 48 hours. We were trapped. That night, I saw it, the thing, the shadow. It stood at the foot of my bed, his head tilted as though studying me. His presence was suffocating, his form shifting like smoke. And where its face should have been, there was nothing, just an empty void. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as it leaned closer, its featureless visage inches from mine. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. By the time the helicopter arrived, I was the only one left. Chris had vanished during the night. I didn't bother looking for him. I just wanted to leave. As we lifted off, I looked back at the station. Through one of the windows, I saw it, the faceless figure, standing perfectly still, watching me go. I'll never go back. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear footsteps in my hallway, and I wonder if I ever truly left. Story number 2. The Forbidden Memory Box. There are places where the earth keeps secrets, dark ones, the kind that stay buried under layers of ice and time, screaming to be forgotten. I should have known better than to dig too deep. But curiosity is a cruel master, and it dragged me and my team into a nightmare we'll never escape, those of us who are left. Anyway, my name's Jack. I'm a researcher, or maybe I was. Now, I'm something else, a survivor, maybe even a lunatic, haunted by what we found. The story I'm about to tell you, well, you won't believe me, and that's fine. I wouldn't believe me either if I didn't have the scars to prove it. It started in the winter of 1978, at an old research station in the middle of goddamn nowhere, Alaska. To be specific, a forgotten outpost abandoned years ago after the usual Arctic horror stories, equipment failures, bad weather, and a few mysterious disappearances no one wanted to talk about. Perfect for our expedition, right? We were there to study climate patterns or something equally dull. But me, I wasn't in it for the science. I was in it for the story, always have been. And when someone told me about the cursed box hidden in the station's storage room, my pulse quickened. The box was the stuff of local legend, an old wooden thing carved with strange symbols, left behind by God knows who. The story went that anyone who opened it would regret it. I figured it was bullshit. Of course, a fun little ghost story to spice up the boredom of research life. That was before we found it. The station was a time capsule. Decades of ice had swallowed its exterior. But inside, everything was preserved like a frozen tomb. Rusted tools, dusty equipment, old notebooks filled with fading ink. And then, in the back of the storage room, behind a wall of overturned shelving, we saw it. The box. It wasn't big, about the size of a shoebox, but it was old, older than anything else in the station. That much was clear. The wood was dark, almost black, and the carvings, Jesus, the carvings, they weren't like anything I'd seen before. Spirals, jagged shapes, and tiny faces etched in the surface, all warped and twisted in ways that made my skin crawl. There was no lock, just a heavy lid, slightly ajar as if inviting us to look inside. I wish we hadn't. It was Maria who opened it first. She was our geologist, sharp as hell but reckless in the way that brilliant people often are. She pried off the lid while the rest of us crowded around, holding our breath. Inside were notebooks, several of them, stacked haphazardly. The pages were yellowed, brittle with age, and covered in frantic handwriting. Words in English, Russian, French, and a dozen other languages I couldn't identify. The same phrases repeated over and over. Help us. Let us out. They're coming. Interspersed with the writing were crude drawings of faces, empty-eyed, gaping-mouthed faces, all contorted in agony. It's just some old scientist's notes, Maria said, flipping through the pages. But there was an edge to her voice, a tremor that didn't match her usual confidence. She tossed the notebook back in the box and laughed nervously. Creepy, but harmless. We should have left it there, sealed it up and buried it in the snow. Instead, we took it back to the common room to study. That night, the wind screamed louder than usual. The station groaned and creaked as if the ice was pressing in from all sides, trying to crush us. Couldn't sleep. Neither could Maria. She sat at the table, poring over the notebooks, muttering to herself. I thought about joining her but decided against it. Something about her posture, hunched, almost predatory, unnerved me. The next morning, Maria was gone. Her boots were still by the door. Her coat hung neatly on the rack. But she wasn't in the station. We searched everywhere, shouting her name, but the only answer was the howling wind. The tracks outside the station led nowhere. Just a few faint impressions in the snow that disappeared after a few yards. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe she wandered off. Maybe she had an accident. But deep down, we all felt it, that cold, gnawing fear that something had taken her. And the box. It was still sitting on the table, the lid slightly open, as if mocking us. The second disappearance happened 2 nights later. Tom, our mechanic, he'd been jumpy ever since Maria vanished, muttering about shadows moving in the corners of the room. We told him it was just his imagination, but now I'm not so sure. That night, I woke up to the sound of his screams. By the time I got to his room, he was gone. The window was open, frost creeping in along the edges, and his flashlight was lying on the floor, flickering weakly. No tracks this time, just nothing, like he'd been erased. That's when I started hearing the voices. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. But then the whispers started, faint, just on the edge of hearing, like someone standing right behind me, breathing words I couldn't understand. I stopped sleeping after that. So did the others. We sat in the common room, watching the box, daring each other to touch it. No one did. Not after what happened to Maria and Tom. But the box didn't need us to touch it. It was already in our heads. By the end of the week, we were down to 3: me, Sarah, and Ben. We decided to leave, but the weather wouldn't let us. A storm rolled in, cutting off all communication and making it impossible to travel. We were trapped. The final night, I saw it, the thing inside the box. I don't know how to describe it. A shadow? A memory? A nightmare given form? It wasn't solid, but it was there, standing in the corner of the room. Its eyes, or the absence of them, boring into me. And then it smiled. A grotesque, jagged smile that seemed to stretch too wide. It whispered my name. I don't remember much after that. Just fragments. The storm breaking. The helicopter arriving. Ben and Sarah were gone. The rescue team found me in the snow, clutching the box, screaming about faces in the dark. They tried to take it from me, but I wouldn't let them. Couldn't. It's still with me now, sitting on the shelf in my apartment, watching. Sometimes, I think I hear it whispering. Other times, I see shapes in the shadows that don't belong. And sometimes, late at night, I open it, because some secrets demand to be remembered, and some memories never let go. Story number 3. The singing beneath. You've heard it before. That old expression about curiosity and cats? Turns out, it's not just cats that get screwed by their curiosity. Sometimes, it's us. I learned that the hard way, down in the frozen guts of Alaska, in a place that was never meant to be explored. It's been 6 months since I came back from the Sterling Research Station. 6 months since I heard it, the singing, and not a night goes by where I don't wake up drenched in sweat, my ears ringing with that cold, echoing melody. I used to think I'd get over it, that the memories would fade like all bad dreams do. I was wrong. It started with a tape. I work in a government archive, the kind of place where old secrets go to rot. Most of it's boring, crumbling files, obsolete blueprints, memos from agencies that don't exist anymore. But every now and then, something comes across my desk that makes me sit up and pay attention. The Sterling Research Station file wasn't even supposed to be on my desk. A mix-up in cataloging. Probably. It was thin, just a handful of reports. Grainy photographs of the station buried under snow. And a single audio cassette labeled Unknown Sound Basement, 1973, in shaky handwriting. Curiosity got the better of me. I dug an old cassette player out of the supply closet, popped the tape in, and hit play. First, there was nothing, just static, like wind howling through a narrow tunnel. I leaned closer, adjusting the volume, and then I heard it, faint, almost buried under the static. A voice. It was singing. The melody was simple, haunting, like a lullaby sung in reverse. The voice itself was wrong. It was high-pitched, but not in a natural way, as if whoever or whatever was singing wasn't human. The notes stretched and wavered, echoing like they'd been recorded in a vast, empty space. My skin prickled. I stopped the tape, rewound it, and listened again and again. By the fifth listen, I was hooked. I had to know where that sound came from. The Sterling Research Station was abandoned in the late 1970s, left to be swallowed by the Alaskan wilderness. Officially, it was shut down due to funding cuts and logistical challenges. Unofficially, rumors about the place had been swirling for decades. Researchers disappearing. Strange sounds reported by staff. Equipment malfunctioning for no apparent reason. I'm not ashamed to admit that I love a good ghost story. And this one, it was irresistible. After weeks of paperwork, phone calls, and some creative lying, I managed to get permission to visit the station. A research expedition, I called it, though I left out the part about the singing. Getting to Sterling was no picnic. A 2-hour flight to Anchorage. Another hour on a tiny plane that felt like it might fall out of the sky at any moment. And finally a snowmobile ride across miles of frozen wasteland. When the station came into view, I almost turned back. It looked like a corpse. The buildings were half buried in snow, their walls streaked with rust and ice. The windows were black and lifeless, like the eye sockets of a skull. The main entrance was frozen shut, so I had to climb in through a broken window, scraping my hands on jagged glass. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rot and mildew. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the floors were slick with ice. My flashlight beam jittered across abandoned desks, overturned chairs, and equipment that hadn't been touched in decades. I found the basement door at the end of a long, dark hallway. It was metal, rusted at the edges, with a padlock hanging uselessly from the latch. Someone had cut it years ago, leaving the door slightly ajar. The singing started as soon as I stepped through. At first, I thought it was in my head, a trick of the wind, or maybe my imagination running wild. But no, it was real. The same melody from the tape, faint but unmistakable, drifting up from the darkness below. I descended slowly, my boots clanging against the metal stairs. The air grew colder with every step, and the smell of mildew was joined by something sharper, almost metallic. The basement was enormous, a maze of concrete walls and exposed pipes. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, but I could see enough to know that this place had been abandoned in a hurry. Papers were scattered across the floor, along with broken glass and rusted tools. And then I saw it, At the far end of the room was a hole in the floor, about 6 feet across, surrounded by caution tape and orange traffic cones. The singing was louder now, rising up from that black void like smoke. I crept closer, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. When I reached the edge, I shone my flashlight down. The beam didn't reach the bottom. I don't remember climbing into the hole. I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was sliding down a steep incline, the walls slick with ice. My flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered into the darkness below. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring the breath from my lungs. The singing was deafening now. It echoed from every direction, surrounding me, filling my head with that cold, alien melody. I scrambled to my feet, fumbling for my flashlight, and froze. There was something in the darkness. At first, I thought it was a shadow, cast by the flickering beam of my flashlight. But it moved, twitched, jerking forward in sudden, unnatural bursts. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and spindly, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. And it was singing. The sound wasn't coming from its mouth. It didn't have one. The song seemed to pour from its very being, vibrating through the air like a living thing. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing tilted its head toward me, and for a moment, I thought I saw faces, dozens of them, flickering across its surface like reflections in a cracked mirror. The faces were screaming. I don't know how I got out. The next thing I remember, I was outside, stumbling through the snow, my lungs burning from the cold. The station was behind me, the basement door hanging open like a yawning mouth. The singing followed me. I quit my job at the archive a week later, moved to a new city, changed my name. But no matter how far I run, I can't escape it. The melody is always there, faint but persistent, like a song stuck in my head. Sometimes, at night, I hear it more clearly, and sometimes, if I close my eyes, I see the faces. I don't know what's down there in the dark, but I know it's still singing. Story number 4. The eyes in the ice. They were watching us. It started as a feeling, subtle at first, a prickling at the back of the neck, a fleeting shadow in the corner of your eye. But soon, it became something more, something undeniable. And once you knew they were there, once you saw them for yourself, you could never unsee them. We shouldn't have stayed. God knows, we should have left the moment we realized. But by then, it was too late. I was one of 6 scientists stationed at the Fairwind Research Outpost, an isolated facility buried deep in the Alaskan tundra. It was the kind of place you went to when you wanted to get away from the world, or when the world didn't have much use for you anymore. Our work wasn't glamorous, just routine climate monitoring and equipment maintenance. It was quiet, lonely, and cold as hell, but I didn't mind. Out there, with nothing but miles of snow and ice in every direction, you could almost forget the rest of the world existed. I should have known better. The first time I felt it, I was outside alone, checking the weather station. It was after dark, the kind of night where the sky seemed impossibly vast, the stars sharp and cold against the black. The wind cut through my parka like a knife, and my breath hung in the air, pale ghost. I don't know what made me turn around. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was nothing at all. But when I did, I saw them, 2 pinpricks of light, glowing faintly in the distance. At first, I thought it was a trick of the ice, reflections of the moonlight or some other natural phenomenon. But then they moved, slowly, deliberately, like they were aware of me. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat. The eyes, if that's what they were, stared back at me for what felt like an eternity before disappearing into the darkness. When I told the others, they laughed it off. Probably just an Arctic fox, Sam said, smirking as he poured himself another cup of coffee. They've got reflective eyes, you know. But it wasn't a fox. A week later, it happened again. This time, it was Rachel. She'd gone out to check the solar panels and came back pale and shaking. I saw them, she said. her voice barely above a whisper. Out by the ridge. There were more of them this time. For maybe 5. They were just watching me. Sam tried to calm her down, but the rest of us exchanged uneasy glances. I could tell from the look in Rachel's eyes that she wasn't imagining things. Later that night, I found her in the common room, staring out the window into the darkness. "They're out there, Jack," she said, not turning to look at me. "I don't know what they are, but they're watching us." After that, the feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just at night anymore. During the day, too, you'd catch glimpses of movement at the edge of the horizon. Shapes darting behind snowdrifts. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper, like the landscape itself was holding its breath. And then there was the photograph. It was Marcus who found it, buried in an old storage locker in the basement. The photo was black and white, faded with age, but the details were clear enough. It showed a group of researchers standing in front of the outpost, smiling awkwardly for the camera. But in the background, barely visible behind the thick sheet of ice covering the window, were the eyes. Dozens of them. They were faint, just glimmers of light, but their intent was unmistakable. They were staring at the camera, at us. That night, the storm hit. It was a bad one, the kind that shakes the walls and drowns out your thoughts with its relentless howling. We huddled in the common room, pretending to focus on our books and card games, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Around midnight, the power went out. The emergency lights flickered to life, casting the room in a sickly red glow. We could hear the wind screaming outside, but it wasn't loud enough to cover the sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but they grew louder, closer, until it sounded like they were right outside the door. "Who the hell would be out there in this?" Sam whispered, his face pale. No one answered. Then the knocking started. It wasn't frantic or desperate, like someone seeking shelter. It was slow, deliberate, almost polite. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. We sat frozen, staring at the door, none of us daring to move. "Should we?" Marcus began, but Rachel cut him off with a sharp shake of her head. "No," she whispered. "Don't open it." The knocking continued for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The next morning, we found the tracks. They weren't human. They weren't animal, either. The prints were too large, too deep, and they seemed to shimmer faintly in the early morning light, as if they weren't entirely solid. We followed them to the edge of the ridge, where they disappeared into the ice. "I think we need to leave," Rachel said, her voice trembling. For once, no one argued. We started packing that afternoon, but the storm had other plans. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, and by nightfall, we were snowed in. That was when the lights came. First, they were faint glimmers on the horizon, like distant stars, but they grew brighter, closer, until they surrounded the outpost. The eyes were back, hundreds of them, glowing cold and pale in the darkness. They didn't move. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. We stayed inside, huddled together, trying to pretend we didn't see them. But the pressure was unbearable, like the walls were closing in. And then, one by one, the others started to disappear. The first to go was Sam. He said he needed some air, that he couldn't breathe. And before we could stop him, he was out the door. We heard him scream once, and then, nothing. Next was Marcus. He was sitting by the window, staring out at the lights, when he whispered, "They're beautiful," and walked outside. By dawn, it was just me and Rachel. "We're not going to make it, are we?" she said, her voice hollow. I didn't answer. When the rescue team arrived 3 days later, they found me sitting in the common room, staring at the photograph Marcus had found. There was no sign of the others. No tracks, no bodies, just the eyes, still watching from the ice. Story number 5. The last day of the research station. There are places humans were never meant to go. Sterling Station wasn't on any map you'd recognize. It was buried deep in the Alaskan tundra, a lonely dot in a sea of white, where the wind screamed louder than the machines that once roared inside. Officially, the station was abandoned because of unmanageable conditions. That's what the report said. Anyway, but that's not the truth. I was there on the last day. I've never told anyone what really happened, what we saw, what we heard. The kind of secrets that freeze your soul and make you pray for something as simple as death. But now, as I write this, I know the truth needs to be told. Because whatever we woke up out there, it's still waiting. I joined the Sterling team in 1974, when the station was already infamous among those in the know. Strange things had been happening there for years: equipment failures, unexplained sounds, missing personnel. The kind of stories that got brushed under the rug with phrases like human error and environmental factors. I didn't care about the rumors. I was young, ambitious, and desperate to prove myself. Sterling Station was a chance to make a name for myself, to contribute to groundbreaking research on climate systems and deep Earth geology. Or so I thought. The last day began like any other. We were down to 6 people, the skeleton crew responsible for maintaining the station while a long-term shutdown plan was being finalized. By then, most of the staff had already left, spooked by months of unexplainable malfunctions and other things. Breakfast was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence where even the sound of chewing feels deafening. Rachel, our systems engineer, broke the silence first. "Anyone else hear that last night?" she asked, not looking up from her oatmeal. "Hear what?" I said, though I already knew. "That hum," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, like machinery, but deeper. And it wasn't coming from the lab. It was coming from under us. That hum wasn't new. We'd all heard it at some point over the past few weeks. A low, almost subsonic vibration that seemed to resonate through the walls and floors. We'd written it off as shifting ice or underground currents, though none of our instruments ever picked it up. But last night, it had been louder. "Maybe we should leave early," Chris muttered, his voice tinged with unease. He was our biologist, normally the skeptic of the group. "This place has been falling apart for months. No shame in cutting our losses." Rachel snorted. "We're not supposed to leave until Monday, and good luck getting a helicopter out here in this weather." She was right. A storm was brewing, the kind that turned the tundra into an impenetrable wasteland. We were stuck. The first sign that something was wrong came around noon. I was in the lab, running final diagnostics on our equipment, when the lights flickered. Nothing unusual, power outages were common this far north. But then the machines started up. The computers whirred to life, their screens flashing with strings of code I didn't recognize. The centrifuge spun violently, even though it wasn't plugged in. And the environmental monitor, which hadn't worked in months, began spitting out nonsensical readings. Temperatures of 200 degrees. Pressure levels that didn't make sense. I called Rachel over. "Tell me this is some kind of joke," I said, gesturing to the chaos. She frowned, checking the cables and circuits. "None of this is possible," she murmured. "Half this equipment isn't even connected to the grid anymore." The humming started again, louder this time, closer. We looked at each other, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. By mid-afternoon, the station had turned into a madhouse. Doors slammed shut on their own, refusing to open even when we disengaged the locks. The intercom system crackled to life, broadcasting faint whispers in a language none of us could understand. And then there were the voices. They echoed down the hallways, soft and distant at first, like someone calling out for help. But the more we listened, the less human they sounded, distorted, layered, like a choir of broken radios. Chris was the first to crack. "This isn't right," he muttered, pacing back and forth. "We shouldn't be here. We should never have been here." That evening, the writing appeared. It was Rachel who found it. Scrawled across the wall of the main corridor in thick black letters, "We were never alone." "Who the hell did this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Not me," Chris said, his face pale. I shook my head. "This wasn't here an hour ago." The words seemed to pulse, as if the wall itself was alive. The final straw came at 11:47 p.m. We were gathered in the control room, trying to contact anyone who could get us out. The radios were dead, the satellite phone useless. And then, without warning, the entire station went dark. The emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in a dim, blood-red glow. The humming was deafening now, shaking the walls, rattling our teeth. And the voices, they were everywhere. "Do you hear that?" Chris whispered. We all did. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the hallways. Rachel grabbed a wrench, her hands trembling. "Whatever it is," she said, "it's not human. They came for us, one by one." Chris went first. He'd wandered off, saying he was going to check the generator. We heard him scream, a short, sharp sound that cut off too suddenly. When we went to look, there was no trace of him, just his flashlight, still spinning on the floor. Rachel was next. She swore she saw something in the hallway, a shadow that moved against the light. She ran after it, yelling for us to follow. But by the time we caught up, she was gone. That left me and Marcus, the station's head researcher. We barricaded ourselves in the common room, our breaths fogging in the icy air. "We never should have come here," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "They were right. This place is wrong." He was staring at the wall, at the words that had appeared there. "You can't leave." The last thing I remember is the sound of the door creaking open. Even though we'd locked it, a shadow fell across the room, stretching impossibly long. And then, nothing. When I woke up, I was outside, lying in the snow. The storm had passed, and the station was silent. They found me a week later, delirious and half-frozen. I told them everything, but they didn't believe me. They never do. Now, I spend my days staring at the walls, at the message I carved there before they took me away. We were never meant to stay. And at night, I hear the humming. They're still out there, waiting,